The sun hung high over Riverside Park, casting golden light through the canopy of towering oak trees. Laughter echoed across the open field where children played, joggers moved in steady rhythm along the paved trails, and families lounged on picnic blankets. It was the kind of day that made the world feel simple, peaceful. Monica Carter sat alone on a wooden bench near the pond, a thick hardcover book resting open on her lap. She had spent most of her career locked in courtrooms, wading through legal battles that left little time for moments like this. A well-respected attorney with a reputation for fierce advocacy, Monica had built a career on standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Yet today, she wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a strategist or an activist. She was just a woman enjoying an afternoon with a book. That peace shattered with the sharp screech of tires. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, its presence disrupting the easy flow of the park. Nearby conversations hushed. A few onlookers turned their heads, curiosity flickering across their faces. Two uniformed officers stepped out, Officer Bradley and Officer Kent. Their expressions were unreadable, but their movements were purposeful as they scanned the area. Their eyes landed on Monica, the only person sitting alone. "Ma'am," Bradley called out, his voice firm but lacking warmth. "Mind if we have a word?" Monica glanced up, her calm demeanor unshaken. She closed her book slowly, placing it neatly on the bench beside her. "Of course," she said. Kent took a step forward, his posture stiff. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he stated. "Can you tell us what you're doing here?" Monica's brow furrowed. "Suspicious activity?" She gestured to her book. "I'm sitting in a public park, reading." Bradley crossed his arms. "Can we see some ID?" A quiet tension crackled in the air. Monica had handled enough police encounters, both professionally and personally, to recognize when a situation was headed in the wrong direction. She knew her rights, knew that sitting on a bench, minding her own business, wasn't grounds for an interrogation. She kept her voice even. "May I ask why you're requesting my ID?" "It's routine," Kent replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. A small group of park-goers had started to gather at a distance, their curiosity shifting toward concern. Monica exhaled slowly. She knew that pushing back too hard could escalate things, but complying without question was equally dangerous. Finally, she reached into her bag and handed over her driver's license. Bradley studied it with unnecessary scrutiny. "Monica Carter," he read aloud, almost like a challenge. "What's your business here, Ms. Carter?" Monica met his gaze without flinching. "I live in this city. I came to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" Bradley's jaw tightened. He handed her ID back, but neither he nor Kent made a move to leave. Instead, they lingered, their questions shifting from procedural to invasive. "You always carry a book like that around?" Kent asked, his tone edged with something Monica couldn't quite name. "Are you here alone, or waiting for someone?" Bradley added, his hand resting near his belt, a subtle but deliberate gesture. Monica's patience thinned. "Unless you can tell me what crime I've committed," she said firmly, "I won't be answering any more questions." That was the moment it shifted. Bradley took a step closer. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. "We're just doing our job." "And I know the law," Monica countered, her voice unwavering. "Sitting in a park isn't illegal." Reason, however, was not what they were after. Bradley suddenly reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said, despite the fact that Monica hadn't moved. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, startled. "Stop resisting," he repeated, louder this time, as if performing for the growing audience. Monica barely had time to react before the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The weight of them was shocking, not physically, but in what they represented. Around her, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone to record, while a young woman standing near the edge of the pond raised hers, capturing everything. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was an unspoken exchange, a silent plea. Don't let this be ignored. But as the police car door slammed shut behind her, Monica knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The police cruiser's interior smelled of stale leather and sweat. Monica sat in the back, her wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs. The irony of the situation gnawed at her. How many times had she defended clients in this very position? How many times had she fought against wrongful arrests, excessive force, and abuses of power. And now she was on the other side of it. The ride to the station was silent except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Bradley and Kent exchanged no words with her, nor with each other. They didn't need to. Their message had already been made clear. They had the power. Monica turned her gaze to the window, watching the city blur past. She thought of her clients, of the countless stories she'd heard of routine encounters turned into nightmares. She had always believed that knowledge of the law was a shield, that her education, her reputation, and her status would offer some level of protection. But here she was. At the station, the booking process was deliberately humiliating. They took her fingerprints, her mugshot, and made her remove her jewelry. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an unnatural hum, casting a cold glow over the gray concrete walls. The officers handling her intake barely made eye contact, treating her not as a person, but as paperwork to be processed. When they led her to a holding cell, Monica bit the inside of her cheek to keep her anger in check. The door clanged shut behind her. "Enjoy your stay," one of the officers muttered before walking away. She sat down on the cold metal bench, pressing her hands together in her lap. The cuffs had left red marks around her wrists. The sting of them fueled something inside her, not just frustration, but resolve. Monica replayed the events in her mind. The way Bradley had looked at her, the way Kent's hand had hovered near his belt, the way they had escalated the situation with practiced ease. This wasn't about a crime. It had never been about a crime. This was about control. The hours passed in slow, aching increments. At some point, a young officer approached her cell, holding a clipboard. He didn't look smug like the others. He just looked tired. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice flat, "you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer." Monica exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "On what grounds?" "You can discuss that in court." He didn't meet her eyes as he turned to leave. She sat still for a moment, processing. The charges were flimsy, and she knew it. But that didn't mean they wouldn't stick. Cases like hers rarely went in favor of the accused. Still, they had underestimated her. By the time an officer returned to escort her out, Monica had already begun mapping out her next steps. The cool night air hit her like a wave as she stepped outside. Standing by the curb was Rachel Simmons, her closest friend and fellow attorney, arms crossed, phone still in hand. "Monica," Rachel rushed toward her, concern creasing her features. "Are you okay?" Monica nodded, though a slight tremor betrayed her. "I'm fine." The words felt hollow. Rachel studied her face, her lawyer's mind already working through the implications. "I posted bail, but this isn't over." Monica let out a breath, steadying herself. "No, it's not." As they walked toward Rachel's car, the weight of the night settled onto Monica's shoulders. But beneath it, something else took shape. A plan. She wasn't letting this slide. Not this time. The rhythmic tapping of a pen against the wooden table filled Monica's dimly lit kitchen. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched beside her, its warmth fading as quickly as her patience. Legal pads were spread out in front of her, pages filled with hastily scribbled notes, case citations, and legal precedents. The arrest was still fresh. Her wrists still ached, the bruises barely beginning to form. But Monica didn't have time to dwell on the anger simmering beneath her skin. She had work to do. Rachel sat across from her, flipping through a folder of printed documents. "The video's everywhere," she said, shaking her head. "Thousands of views already. People are talking." Monica nodded, unsurprised. The young woman at the park had kept her word. She had uploaded the footage within hours. And now the internet had latched onto the injustice like a wildfire in dry brush. It wasn't just local news picking it up. The video had started conversations across the country. Rachel leaned forward. "You know what this means, right?" Monica did. Public pressure was a powerful force. It had taken down corrupt officials, forced policy changes, even sparked nationwide movements. But it could also be fickle. Attention came and went. If she wanted justice, she had to act fast. "I'm filing a civil rights lawsuit," Monica said, voice steady. "Not just against Bradley and Kent, but against the department. This wasn't just a bad decision by two officers. This is systemic." Rachel exhaled sharply, setting her papers down. "You're sure?" Monica met her gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything." Rachel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's build the strongest case possible. By morning, Monica was back in her office, surrounded by stacks of legal texts and case files. She pulled up similar lawsuits, cross-referencing outcomes, searching for patterns in how the courts had ruled in cases like hers. She had a strong argument: unlawful detainment. She hadn't been given a valid reason for being stopped, let alone arrested. Excessive force. The bruises on her wrist proved that. Violation of civil rights. The officer's behavior fit a pattern of racial profiling that had plagued law enforcement for years. And then there was the video. Rachel had already reached out to the woman who had recorded it, a college student named Vanessa Kim. She was eager to testify if needed. More witnesses had also come forward, offering their accounts of what they had seen in the park that day. Everything was falling into place, but Monica knew better than to believe this would be easy. 2 days after filing the lawsuit, Monica's phone rang. She answered on the second ring. "They're trying to dismiss the case," Rachel said, not bothering with pleasantries. Monica barely blinked. "Of course they are," Rachel sighed. Bradley and Kent's lawyer filed a motion claiming there's no substantial evidence of misconduct. The department's backing them. Monica clenched her jaw. "They're hoping the system will protect them, that if they drag this out long enough, I'll drop it." "Are you going to?" Monica let out a short laugh. "Not a chance." Rachel chuckled softly. "Didn't think so. But Monica, there's something else." Monica sat up straighter. "What?" Rachel hesitated. "You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." Monica's grip on the phone tightened. "Say that again." Rachel sighed. "You heard me. A separate case, an internal misconduct hearing. Bradley and Kent are the defendants, and you're the presiding judge." For a moment, Monica didn't know what to say. It was surreal, almost absurd. The same men who had humiliated her, who had thrown her into a holding cell without cause, were now about to stand before her in a courtroom. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was fate handing her the gavel. The courthouse was quieter than usual that morning, the kind of silence that hummed with anticipation. Monica walked through the marble-floored hallways, her heels clicking against the polished surface. She had spent years in this building, first as a young attorney fighting for her clients, then as a judge, delivering rulings that carried the weight of the law. But today was different. She pushed open the doors to her chambers, letting out a slow breath as she placed her briefcase on the desk. The moment she had learned of her assignment, she had double-checked the case file 3 times, half expecting someone to tell her it was a mistake. But it wasn't. Bradley and Kent weren't here because of her case. They had been accused of excessive force in a separate incident, a traffic stop that had escalated into violence. Their records had red flags, complaints that had never gone anywhere, internal reviews that had been quietly closed. This hearing wasn't criminal court, it was an internal misconduct case, one that could determine whether they kept their badges, and she was the one presiding over it. Monica knew what people would say, that she wasn't impartial, that she had no business overseeing a case involving men who had wronged her. But she had read the case file. She had examined the evidence. And if the department didn't trust her judgment, they could have reassigned the case. They hadn't. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. The bailiff poked his head in. "We're ready, Your Honor." Monica nodded, smoothing out the sleeves of her robe before following him into the courtroom. The room was already filling with quiet murmurs as people found their seats. Reporters lined the back row, their notepads and cameras at the ready. They had caught wind of the irony, of the poetic justice unfolding in real time. At the defense table, Bradley and Kent sat stiffly in their uniforms, whispering to their attorney. When the door to the judge's chambers opened and Monica stepped onto the bench, the reaction was immediate. Bradley's face drained of color. His jaw tightened as he shifted in his seat. Kent exhaled sharply, looking away as if that would change what was happening. Monica took her seat, adjusting the microphone in front of her. She let a moment of silence stretch through the room, letting the weight of the situation settle over everyone present. Then in a clear, steady voice, she spoke. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The attorneys stood for opening statements, their words carefully chosen. The prosecutor laid out the evidence against the officers. body cam footage, witness statements, a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. The actions of Officers Bradley and Kent were not a simple lapse in judgment, the prosecutor stated firmly. They reflect a pattern of excessive force, a disregard for protocol, and a failure to uphold the oath they swore to protect and serve. Monica listened intently, her pen gliding across her notepad. Every so often, her gaze flickered toward the defense table. The two officers sat rigidly, their expressions carefully schooled. But she could see it, the slight twitch of Bradley's fingers, the way Kent's knee bounced under the table. They were nervous. When the defense attorney took the floor, his voice was steady but strained. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the events in question, we argue that the circumstances were more complex than they appear. My clients acted within their training, responding to what they perceived as a potential threat. Monica remained expressionless. She had heard this argument before. It was the same justification she had seen used time and time again to excuse excessive force. As the proceedings continued, witness testimonies painted a damning picture. A young man named Ethan took the stand, his voice shaking as he recounted the night he had been pulled over. They didn't even give me a chance to explain, he said, his fingers gripping the edges of the witness stand. I did everything they told me to do, but it didn't matter. They had already made up their minds. The prosecutor nodded. Did you resist their orders at any point? No, Ethan said, his voice firm. I was scared, but I followed every command. It didn't stop them from throwing me to the ground. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Monica glanced at Bradley and Kent. For the first time, she saw something flicker across Bradley's face, something dangerously close to regret. When it was his turn to testify, he hesitated before speaking. At the time, he said slowly, I believed I was making the right call, but looking back, I could have handled it differently. The prosecutor leaned forward. Handled it differently how? By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground? Bradley opened his mouth but had no answer. Kent wasn't much better. His responses were stiff, rehearsed. Every attempt to justify their actions only reinforced how recklessly they had wielded their authority. By the time the closing arguments were delivered, the energy in the room had shifted. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Monica glanced down at her notes, then up at the two men before her. She had spent weeks preparing to hold them accountable in a different courtroom, as a plaintiff in her own case. Now fate had given her an entirely different kind of power, and she would wield it wisely. We will reconvene next week for my ruling, she announced, striking the gavel. Court is adjourned. As the room emptied, Bradley and Kent lingered near the exit. They hesitated, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this wasn't over. Not for them, and certainly not for her. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread about the hearing, about the irony of Judge Monica Carter presiding over a case involving the very officers who had arrested her weeks before. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of hope. Hope that for once, accountability would not be an illusion. Monica sat at the bench, her expression unreadable as she looked out at the sea of faces. Reporters lined the back wall, their pens poised. At the defense table, Bradley and Kent sat side by side, their uniforms crisp, their faces drawn. They had spent the past week waiting for this moment, no doubt hoping for a ruling that would allow them to walk away unscathed. Monica wouldn't give them that. She cleared her throat, her voice steady as she began. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness, she said. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victim. Bradley and Kent stared straight ahead, their hands clasped together. They didn't look at her, not yet. The evidence presented has demonstrated that Officers Bradley and Kent acted with unnecessary force, disregarding the protocols they were sworn to uphold, she continued. Their actions were not only unjustified, but indicative of a troubling pattern, one that cannot and will not be ignored. She let the words settle over the room. The silence was suffocating. Monica took a measured breath before delivering her ruling. Effective immediately, Officers Bradley and Kent will be suspended without pay for 6 months. They will be required to complete an extensive retraining program focusing on de-escalation and racial bias in policing. Furthermore, this incident will be formally recorded in their disciplinary records, which will be considered in any future employment decisions within law enforcement. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some were satisfied, others wanted more. Monica knew that no punishment would ever feel like enough, not when so many others had suffered worse with no justice at all. Bradley shifted in his seat. For the first time, he looked at her. "Your Honor," he started, his voice hesitant. He seemed to struggle with what to say. Finally, he settled on two words. "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough." But Monica nodded, acknowledging his words without absolution. Because true change didn't come from apologies. It came from action. She struck the gavel. "This court is adjourned." Bradley and Kent stood, their faces unreadable as they gathered their things. They didn't look back as they left the courtroom, disappearing into the hall. But for Monica, this wasn't over. That evening, she attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was filled with people eager to share their stories, their frustrations, their hopes. As she listened, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This case was just one step in a much larger fight. An older woman approached her after the meeting, gripping Monica's hand tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "What you did in that courtroom, it means the world to us." Monica smiled softly. "This is just the beginning." The following week saw meaningful conversations between community leaders, law enforcement, and activists. The case had sparked something, a push for reforms, a demand for transparency. It wasn't just about Bradley and Kent. It was about all the cases like hers that never made it to court. Monica stood on the steps of the courthouse one afternoon, watching a group of young activists gather for a peaceful rally. She knew the system was far from perfect. Change was slow, frustrating, and often met with resistance. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting for, and she would keep fighting. For justice, for accountability, for all the voices that had been silenced for far too long.